Symbols 10. Notice right away that 10 can be designated by two hands. Half of a 10 is 5, or a hand. There are universal proportions. If I want to throw a spear, I have to find the dynamic pivot on a spear by which I can get maximum power. The maximum power would be from the back of the spear, but it's very difficult to hold the spear all the way back, and so you have to compromise and use a dynamic point about 2/3 back from the spear point. If you throw a javelin with the hand holding it about 2/3 of the way back, you get the maximum thrust that you can get with human physiology. If you build a sling, which you can cradle the back of the javelin into, and you can throw it that way, you get about 3-4 times the thrust. A good spear thrower in Paleolithic times could throw a spear through most mammals, but couldn't throw one through the hide of a mammoth. So about 30,000 years ago, human beings learned to make these slings to hold the spears so that you could throw it through the hide of a mammoth. And there's an enormous jump then when we discover new principles, new relationalities, and we call that now technology, but technology is just applying to our activities a structure of intelligence about the elements, about what it is and what it does and how you can use it, and that's all that it means. In our time, the mind, traditionally, in the civilization that's now crumbling before our eyes, the mind was always used, like the hand, at a place where an individual ego could throw the understanding. And that handhold was largely within an individual. Someone who has the capacity to step outside of their body, step outside of their culture, step outside of their tribe. And it's not occult, it's just simply something that happens quite frequently. We step outside our bodies every time we have moments of ecstasy, or moments of terror, or moments of insight, or moments of memory, or reverie, or dreams. So we're constantly coloring outside the line. When those aspects of ourselves are factored in, the egotistical handhold on the application of technology, on the application of knowledge, on the application of technique, severely limits us. And so we have to learn to balance our thrust in a different way, in a new way, like the spear thrower with the sling. And so we have to learn to use our application with a different focus. And instead of having an ego-based focus within ourselves, we can have a person-based focus, which includes the resonant areas around us as well as ourselves. So that a person is not just ourselves physically in a body, or even just the mind, but it is the resonance of ourselves in all the relationalities that we have. That's also a part of ourselves. And so an education like this takes, for real, that larger pattern, that larger dimension of ourselves as the practical issue. And actually, in a comparison, the education that is offered in schools generally now, whether it's universities or weekend seminars or whatever it is, all of those forms are obviated by this more transcendent application, by this more resonant scope. And so this education has, at this particular juncture, we're now talking about symbols, it has a quality of looking towards next year. And next year is the exploration of all the resonant qualities of our person, of all the larger transcendent dimensions and capacities of ourselves, which certainly exist, which certainly function and are important. And the first of those, as we will find in January, is vision. And vision used to be called, in ancient times, magic. It was called magic because the word that was used for it came from ancient Iran, the Iran of about 4,000 years ago, actually. And in Iran of about 4,000 years ago, there were a group of people, men and women, at that time, who were called magi. And our term magic comes all the way from a lineage that goes back to that time period. The magi of about 4,000 years ago lived at a time when a previous civilization was very much in decline. And superstition had come in place of what we would call science. And instead of the person quality, a kind of a transcendent demonology and angelology. You know, angels are Iranian originally. Demons are Iranian. The devas of Sanskrit India are gods, but the devas of Avestic Iran are demons. Mythic images can go either way. They can go positive or minus. Mythic images are completely ambivalent. In the fluidity of language, what we would call positive or negative is completely ambivalent. It's only by a choice, by a stylization that one inculcates, that you come to prefer one quality as positive and the other as negative. You can have very advanced cultures that are completely reverse. When we read in Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture, one of the cultures that she took a look at was the Dobu. And the Dobu live on an island where resources very tight, and everyone is paranoidally suspicious of everyone else with just cause. But the Dobu have completely reversed the valuations that we would hold. And for them, there's nothing like preemptive cunning to do someone else in before they do you in. And one doesn't even have to go to the Dobu. We can take a look at late 1996 Moscow, and you can see that only by being in a mafioso type corporation do you have a chance of getting ahead. And so the gangs have won there. The Al Capones are right. That's the positive value. That's the life-giving value. And the police, the cops, the Elliot Nesses, they're the negative. They're the old-fashioned way. All this is to say is that on the mythic level, there's an ambivalence of value. But on the ritual level, there's no ambivalence whatsoever. Because we've seen in our education that ritual has to do with existence. And existence is the objectivization of life. And life, like a very grand woman, is quite particular about what she goes for. She goes for certain life-giving things and completely disregards those elements, those things, those relationalities that do not contribute to life. Or one can put it another way and say evolution favors those who are really fit to live and are trying or experimenting, are using variations that try to give them an advantage to fit into whatever kind of a evolutionary niche there is, or make the jump that one has to make sometimes in order to survive. And those elements that are extraneous, those figures who embody them die off, even to the extent of mass extinctions, even to the extent of the entire planet having a complete revolution in its life forms, like the end of the age of the dinosaurs, who had been around for 100 million years. Within about 20 years, they were gone, more or less. That was it. So that there is this quality, I guess the phrase that comes in our own time is the phrase from the King James Version of the New Testament, a phrase of Jesus, in the twinkling of an eye. So that nature is quite mysterious. Mother Nature, to use the Sanskrit name for her, Prakriti, Ma Prakriti, is very particular. She's a grande dame. She wants to have life, and that's her only concern. And what doesn't add to life, she withdraws power. She withdraws her favor. And the power and the favor of nature, we saw in our education at the beginning, is something which men and women have always characterized. They've always used a term that translates as the English word mystery. Nature is a mystery. It's not a comedy. It's not a tragedy. It's a mystery. So that in the flow of nature, there's an ambivalence that has three values. It's a tri-value. So instead of an ambivalence, there's this three quality to it. We don't even have a good word in English to call it by that. So that when existence comes and it favors an objective cut and dry, yes and no, it favors oppositions. It favors being characterized in terms of dyads, in terms of dualities, in terms sometimes of pairs. The two nature characterizes it. But existence also has a unity to it, the unity of Mother Nature. Her whole pattern is a pattern. It's a oneness. And so while there is a oneness to existence, there's also a duality in the manifestation of it. If we wanted to characterize nature, it would be very difficult for us to say that nature has a unity. We could say that, but we would have to qualify it all the time. And the more that we knew, the more we would have to qualify it. Nature, rather than a unity, is a mystery. And if we want to give it a designation, we found that the best designation is that which the Chinese gave it, a zero. The Tao counts, but you can't count it. It occurs, but it's not there to be had. You can't grasp it, but you can participate with it. And so zero participates with our activity. It participates with the unity of Mother Nature. It participates even with the duality that comes into play with maintaining existence on its right vector. But when we saw that nature and ritual work in this way, almost like a binary language of 0 and 1, so that nature and ritual, or nature and existence, the mystery of nature, the unity of existence, work as like a binary language. And with that 0 and that 1, reality seems to be able to right itself in such a way that there's an ongoing proliferation of drama. There's a constant waterfall, a cascade of things, situations, and possibilities. And that this happening is so ongoing that we can only provisionally make a beginning. And the beginning that we make occurs as some kind of a nexus out of which forms begin to weave themselves. And when they weave themselves, it's as if the very act of weaving themselves confers formal existence upon them. So that we found in our education that there's an odd quality to the mystery of nature. If you do something, nature responds to it and makes it real. I can remember an old German Jewish saying my grandmother used to say. She used to say, don't frown too much because your face may freeze and you'll have the frown for eternity. Just an odd kind of a folk wisdom that existence is peculiar and needs to be treated with respect because behind it is Mother Nature, and she commands respect. She expects respect. And while she reciprocates with goodness for life-giving actions, she also reciprocates without even batting an eye with extinction for non-life supporting situations. So that nature and ritual, we found, have this odd kind of bind together, that nature really has a three-value flow to it. And the way that we keep track of it, the traditional way in which men and women kept track of it, was that it follows a cycle. In terms of existence, it follows a seasonal cycle. But in terms of nature, in terms of its own mystery, we use the ancient Chinese formulation of it, that nature follows a 5-phase transformation energy cycle. This 5-phase energy cycle, when it comes out of the mystery of the fluidity of the process of nature and comes into existence, it's like two of the values make the form. It's like comedy and tragedy make the form, and mystery occurs as the background for those two. So that the third element is like a background which allows the other two to have center stage. All the spotlights, all the color lights are on comedy and tragedy. There are no lights at all on mystery, and yet mystery is there, but there is a background. So existence has a very recognizable tone. It has almost a taste. It's apprehendable with great certainty because it has a polarity quality to it. The very polarity of it makes it palpable, makes it graspable. The polarity of things matches the polarity of the hand, matches the polarity of time itself, matches the polarity of space. And because they're all aligned with the same polarity, grasping works. Existence has this kind of a quality. But men and women have never been so stupid as in this age to forget that there is a mystery background that, courtesy of doing nothing at all, allows an amphitheater for this polarity to work in. And that this amphitheater, the stage itself, is a part of the play. And that if you're caught up all the time, like the ego is, in watching the play and forgetting that it's theater, you miss that this is exemplary rather than real. It's an example of a possibility, but doesn't exhaust the total reality at all. And so the ego gets caught up in these dramas, and it's like life or death, whether this episode turns out. You see? It's like that. It's like that. When language enters into the picture, when myth comes into play, myth is a process like nature. And the mystery that was the background in ritual comes back into play, so that language again has this three value. It's comic, it's tragic, it's mysterious, all at the same time. So language is at once a higher level than just simply existence. Myth is always an indexing power above ritual. But without ritual to ground it, language would become so transcendentally mysterious that one would say nothing. It's like the classic statement in world literature is the first realization of the historical Buddha, when he first came into full, deep samadhi and had his realization. The first impulse that came to him after 7 days of meditating under the Bodhi tree, an impulse came to share this. But immediately, the thought was there's no one here to really share it. And there's no one really out there to share it with. And there's no real language which would convey it from the nobody who is here to the nobodies who are out there. And then 2 traveling merchants came by. 2 guys on their way on a trading mission, and they saw this meditator sitting under the tree, probably glowing, charismatic. So like all businessmen, they thought, we need some luck. Huh? Holy men are luck. So they sat down, they said, share with us a little bit. Tell us something. And so they offered him food. And the sutra records that the Buddha's spirit saw the food offered, but also realized that had no hands with which to grasp the bowl, had no mouth with which to eat, and no digestion with which to use it. And then came the realization that in pure transcendental spirit, there is no body. But the spirit is so at home wherever it's going to be, it can also be at home in the body. Even though it's at home anywhere in reality, it can also be at home at an objective focus, which is that body. And so without thinking about it any further, the Buddha accepted the food. And as soon as he accepted the food, it's like a bowl of rice with a little bit of milk. And in India in those days, they used to put a little bit of cardamom and so forth to make it palatable. They didn't have salt and pepper. So as soon as he takes it and he tastes it, he remembers that at one time, when he was like super trying yogi, for 7 years he tried every single high-powered yoga that there was to master everything, going to master himself. And he got to the point to where he had reduced himself literally to a skin-covered skeleton. The ultimate diet is relentless search for power and control, like that. Hatha yoga run wild. And of course, the body did the only thing it can do. It fell in the dust. Right? The bones get it and they And he had had his head raised by an old woman who had forced a gruel of milk and rice and honey into his mouth and had brought him back. And he realized that the mortification of the body did not do it. That the mortification of the body was extraneous to transcendence. It didn't matter at all. And so later on, when the Buddha began teaching, and he stuck around for 45 years and he taught, his principal diet was whatever they give you in your bowl, you eat. Whatever it is. Whoever that you're with, whatever they're eating, you eat that. You participate in their life, in their nature, in their ritual. Because only by doing that will they be able to participate in your language. And if they can participate in your language, then they can interiorize that language and their mind will come into consonance with yours. That's how it works. It sounds simple. It's hard to do. It's very difficult to do. Because the mind space, when it's natural, it's very mysterious and it's very open. In fact, it's boundless. But it gets stylized to have certain boundaries, certain perimeters. And it's not like these are weird, irregular shapes, but these are like perfect bubbles. So the mind is filled with perfect thought bubble, generated by one center and one center only, the ego. I'm it, and this is my domain, and it's nice and round, and it's mine. So if a language starts to interiorize into that thought bubble, that starts to change the pressure, to change the mix. The ego responds by trying to assimilate it and expand. So that thought bubble gets larger and more expanded, and finally realizes, because the ego makes a reductive mistake all the time, that the body is its turf. And that it has figured out the mind-body relationship, and if the mind expands too much, the head's not going to be able to contain it. The famous story that Heinrich Zimmer tells in his little book, The King and the Corpse, that Joseph Campbell translated into English, and the Bollingen Foundation published in a book of the same title, The King and the Corpse. The story of ancient India, where the young prince is threatened with certain death, and this magician comes to help him and says, "You're being threatened by occult magical powers, and the only way to deal with it was with a magical cure. And what you need to do is at midnight tonight, you need to go to the graveyard, and there'll be a body hanging from a tree, and you need to cut that body down and bring it over to a circle which I will draw on the ground, and I will use this dead body as a focus to take the demonic pressures out of you and put it into this dead body, and then you'll be free." And when he goes to the cemetery, which in those ancient times was full of cremated bodies and rotting corpses, and here was something suspended from a tree, and all this mist of smoke from cremations drifting around in this eerie glow, kind of like a Hieronymus Bosch painting of hell. And as soon as he cuts the body down and starts to tote it over to the magician in the circle, the body says, "I have a riddle, and if you can't answer this riddle, your head will explode." And so the compulsion right away is that the ambivalence of polarity is thrown into a language form called a riddle. And if you can't resolve it, then your head will explode. So the ego is threatened right away, instantly. A dagger held to its throat. And so the prince in the story that Heinrich Zimmer tells and Joseph Campbell translated and the Bollingen Foundation published. He gets the answer to the riddle, and as soon as he does, the body is magically back hanging from the tree. But the threat of occult pressure death is with him, and he realizes he's got to go back and cut down the body. Another riddle. Panic, answer, back from the tree. He gets caught in this tape loop, is what we would call it today. Finally, something deep in him that he forgot, something from the mystery level, that's the background that allows polarities to be polar, but doesn't get caught up in it, uses the well-known 1990s phrase. We can't say it on camera, can we? And the dead body says, now you have broken the spell, because I was a zombie in control of that magician over there. He's the one who's been threatening you all this time. And as soon as you would have gotten me, the dead body, over there, he was going to cut your head off. So when you get over there with me, because now you can carry me over there, as soon as you set me down, take your knife out, and when you rise up, cut his head off. And he does this, and he survives. The loss of one's head. The loss of one's ego bubble. Thomas Mann wrote a beautiful little novel about this called The Transposed Heads. Thomas Mann got a little more finer than Joseph Campbell did. The principle involved is not one of victory, but one of reciprocity. In a reality where existence must have polarities to be, to survive, you cannot have a victory of one element of the polarity over the other and expect it to be real. It's like asking Mother Nature to cut the throat of her own daughter. Existence must have polarity. That's the way it works. But the mystery of nature allows for exchange. The polarities do not allow for exchange with each other, but the third element, the mystery, allows for them to exchange, or parts of them to exchange with other parts of them. So that there's such a principle that arises then called integration. And integration is when one or more parts of one or more polarities exchanges reciprocally with the other. Now, when this first happens, in nature it happens all the time, seamlessly, and no one knows. It's what is the process of nature. It's the driving engine of the matrix of change of nature. When the Chinese wanted to understand this, they had to finally get to the level of interiorizing language enough to get symbols that could objectify it. Because symbols are as objective for the mind as the body is for existence. The mind is quite real. It's objectively real. When the Chinese got to this symbolic level, they were able to integrate symbols enough to express and to hold the meaning. And the amulet that held the meaning was the Tai Chi, the Tao symbol. And the Tao symbol was a powerful amulet made 5,000 years ago. The sage who made it traditionally in China's name is Fuxi. Fuxi is always portrayed as long fingernails and long hair, gnarled toes with long nails, wearing leopard skin, and seated in Chinese pre-historic warlord fashion. But what he's looking at is a series of symbolic diagrams, the trigrams, written in the dust. And next to it, crawling along, is a tortoise. And those trigrams we saw, there are 8 of them. Those trigrams are the symbolic presentation of polarity, and there are only 2 kinds of lines. One kind is an unbroken line, the other is a broken line. The 1 and the 0, symbolically expressed, but arranged in triads, so that the order, the set, has a 3-part quality, but the 3 parts have to be filled with only 2 varieties. And so one or the other has to be doubled all the time, has to be paired. But the trick, the knack, the insight 5,000 years ago of Fuxi is that in the symbolic presentation, what counts is the unpaired line. So if you have a set, if you have a trigram with 2 broken lines and 1 unbroken line, the set takes the value of the unbroken line. If you have 2 unbroken lines and 1 broken line, the set takes the value of the singularity and becomes an unbroken trigram. So that the third value of mystery enters into the symbolization of the polarity raised to an indexing level of a set of 3, a triad, where somebody can work then with the powers of reciprocity. But because those sets have 3 parts, the line that counts, the singular line among the pair of opposites, can have 3 different places. It can be in the first place, it can be in the second place, it can be in the third place. And so too its complement. The opposite can be in the first, second, or third places. So when you have these, when you arrange them, like in 2 columns, you have 2 sets of 3 trigrams. This set are all the positions that the unbroken line can take. The first place, the second place, the third place. This set of trigrams has all the places that the unbroken line can be dominant. And the Chinese usually go from the bottom up, so the first place is on the bottom, the second place in the middle, the third place in the top. So then you have these 2 columns. But because of using symbols, because one is using an integration power, because one is using the mental objectivity of the 3 value mystery, comedy, tragedy qualities that are there in nature, the mind is reaching all the way back to complete the natural cycle. So it's using polar pairs, but in triadic sets. One also then has to include integral culminations, because they also occur. And so one has to take abstractly the bottom line, the middle line, and the third top line, and put them together, and you have a 4th trigram. On one column, it's all 3 are unbroken. On the other, it's all 3 are broken. So that one has 2 sets of 4 trigrams each. But the 4th trigram, the top trigram, is due to an artifact of integration functioning. It's the bottom 3 trigrams that are the actual process that happens, that not only happens in nature, but also happens in language, and applies not only to existence and the body, but applies also to the objectivity of the mind. So that in those 3 trigrams and those 2 columns, the pivot, the place of equanimity, is the middle trigram of each one. And Fuxi discovered that you can exchange the middle trigrams out of both columns. And both columns will work exactly like they did before, except with an added capacity. In addition to holding polarized existent forms, they now hold symbolically transformational forms. And the Tai Chi was the amulet to hold that together. The little spot of white in the dark is the middle trigram from the other column serving in this column. The little spot of dark in the light is the reciprocal exchange of that trigram from the other column. So once they had the Tai Chi as an amulet, as a symbol that could hold that understanding, that meaning, that valuation, it was able to be held in such a way that the power of comprehension went back and recalibrated everything before it. And the Chinese, like ourselves, absolutely astounded that not only do symbols recalibrate language so that language becomes symbolically alert, words get qualities that didn't have before. When we were only telling stories, tribal stories, the words were of certain quality. Now, as Homer says, the words have wings. They're highly mobile. They can have metaphorical meanings. They can have allegorical meanings. They have paradoxical meanings, ironic nuances. Words become living. It's a living language. A language that can transform is a living language. And in no small way, because a living language, when applied to existence, modifies existence. Existence changes. The animals don't stay the same. The plants don't stay the same. They change. People don't stay the same. They change. The stones don't stay the same. They change. As soon as a symbolic calibration works through a living language, why do you think they call Jesus the Word? Then existence is able to be transformed and it changes. It can change its qualities. The only question one has to ask or to answer for oneself is, how does all this set with Mother Nature? And it turns out that she gives approval by not Xing us out. Probably the first men and women who used symbols to recalibrate their tribes, their existence, were very worried. And they were very overjoyed to find that Mother Nature accepts that. She goes for that. It's all right by her. We can play with nature, and it's okay. That life energy participates with symbolic transformation. But once symbolic transformation happens, once the entire natural cycle of nature, ritual, myth, and symbol begins to change, nature is no longer the only player. Something else comes into play. And that's what the Chinese call the fifth value. The West called it magic. We today call it consciousness. The Chinese said of this that this must be the final Tao of the whole thing. But the old archetype of keeping a square of attention, a frame of reference, the pair of pairs, limitation on objectivity, the way in which polarity stylizes existence, and that mental existence is limited by squares, by pairs of pairs, by frames of reference, by a square of attention. as a fifth quality comes into play, the first quality begins to subside and drops out of the frame of reference. It doesn't drop out of existence because it never existed in the first place. It was nature. It was mysterious. But what it does is it slides into its mystery mode of being in the background. It counts. You have to count it. It's there, but it has no designation. It's the amphitheatrical stage upon which whatever play is going on happens. It's not a part of the play, but it's the overall background dimension. One says that this is the theater, but the background is the amphitheater. And so consciousness has to do with amphitheatrical distances. It has that kind of a quality. It has real pizzazz. It has magic. It has unbelievable charisma. And because of its initial affinity to nature, because Mother Nature allows for this, it's like she's saying, all right, my dance is not going to be a part of the frame of reference. I'll be the background, but this new dimension is going to be a part of the frame of reference. And because it was so different, men and women, when they first got to it in the Greek language, they used terms that translate as secret nature. They didn't call it magic right away. It was only after the exposure to the Iranian, Egyptian, Pythagorean realm. But that term of secret nature, consciousness is secret nature. And because now it was a part of the frame of reference, they had to find ways to talk about this. And so existence, ritual, was the beginning of that frame of reference, the body. Myth, language, that was the heart. Symbols, thought, that was the mind. So you had body, heart, mind, and then you had this fourth secret nature, which was like some intuitive quality, a spirit. So then the frame of reference became, for the very first time, body, heart, mind, and spirit. And to symbolize that one understood this process, yes, we know how to do this. One used not natural water, but spirit water. One used a spirit water which now had an alcohol in it. Because organic alcohols are due to a process of distillation, which is the chemical way of transcending. The water turns into wine. And so wine becomes the symbol of new frame of reference, truncated by the first and last sides of the frame of reference, a spiritual body. The secret nature, a spiritual body. And in this way, the wisdom of men and women many thousands of years ago came to a point of maturation where for the first time, when they figured out in retrospect what had happened, they asked a very important question. If we can transform once, can we transform again? What would come out if we shift the frame of reference? We shifted it from nature at a base to ritual at a base. What happens if we shift it from ritual to myth? If we put myth at the base, what's going to come out? And what came out was art. Let's take a break. Let's come back to where we are and what are we doing? We're thinking about, we're feeling about, we're intuiting about, we're sensing about. We're using 4 functions. And those 4 functions, sensation, feeling, thought, intuition, are a way of talking about that square of attention, that frame of reference. The first modern person to use those four functions to talk about this frame of reference was a German genius named Schiller, whose presence is obviously here today. Hail Schiller. And Schiller's best pal was Goethe. And when Schiller and Goethe wrote letters back and forth to each other, it was a remarkable correspondence. It's translated into every language in the world in a couple of volumes, and they're two guys with IQs of 200. So it's quite a ping pong game. Schiller's four functions passed into German philosophic thought and resurfaced in the 20th century in Carl Jung's psychology. And Jung took Schiller's four functions as the frame of reference for a personality typology. And when you look at Jung's first really great book, The Psychology of Types, 1921, he shows that there's a tremendous advantage to characterizing men and women by personality types according to the emphasis on one of these functions, one of these four functions. There's a sensation type. There's a feeling type. There's a thinking type. There's an intuitive type. Yeah, we have all four functions, but we tend to favor one of the four as like our pointer, our vanguard. But Jung was wise enough, he's an uncanny old magician. He was wise enough to understand that existence always happens in polarized pairs. So that there are not only four functions that work one way, but these four functions can work another way. And so he came up in his Psychology of Types with a psychological way of talking about the two polarities of the four functions. And he said that there is an introvert and an extrovert. So you can have a sensation extrovert, like Stallone in Cliffhanger. Or you can have a sensation introvert. God forbid some mass murderer, serial killer. You can have a feeling introvert, like a Brahms. Or you can have a feeling extrovert, like Mozart, the Sun King. He's a genius at feeling, emphasized frame of reference for the four functions, but in an extrovert way. He could perform. Whereas Brahms had a tough time performing, but there's no way that Brahms is not up to snuff in terms of feeling intelligence. And so on with thinking and with intuition. And so what you get with Jung's typology, the four functions and the two types, you get an 8-part stylization of personality types, which actually is much more insightful than astrological signs as a characterization for modern men and women. The astrological constellations come from ancient Babylonia and get filtered through Rome. The oldest astrology textbook is Manilius from the Roman Empire, and it got completely stylized in such a way that its application is fresh frozen, freeze-dried at that era. Astrology worked perfectly well in the 1st century AD. But 2,000 years later, Even the immutable constellations have shifted a little bit. And we now live in a universe where the influences on us, if you're going to do astrology, you have to have all 88 constellations, not just 12. And I don't know of a single astrologer who's mastered the astrology of 88 constellations. But if you take this kind of a typology, its symbolic structure of effectiveness is because it is a frame of reference, and it has the positive and negative, or the inner and outer, of the way in which a symbolism in its amulet typology would be applicable. You can have any content whatsoever, but if the content distributes itself in this universal form, a pair of squares, you making an 8-part quality. One of the squares will be conscious. You'll be conscious that you're using it. And one of the squares will be subconscious. You'll use it, but you won't be aware that you're using it. So we have 2 frames of reference that modulate together. One is a square of attention. The other is a square of background, or a square of insight. So along with the square of attention, there's a square of insight. Now when a 5th function comes into play, like vision, which is magic, or which is consciousness, however you want to style it, as that comes into play, nature slides out of play. It's still there. In fact, it still counts quite a bit, but it's in the square of insight rather than the square of attention. And consciousness joins mind, heart, and body in the square of attention. So there's such a thing, it's quite actual, of being self-conscious. I can be conscious of this body. And when I'm conscious of this body, as in a yoga, or as in athletics, athletics is a Athenian Greek style of yoga. When one sees the classic Zeus, he's not the figure in the clouds with the long beard, but he's the dynamic nude male who stands perfectly poised. He can throw the spear of lightning because of his balance. And Zeus's balance comes because he has overthrown the previous alpha male in an outdated cosmology, who was Chronos, was time. So that Zeus has displaced time as the head god. And Prometheus tells him, there's somebody coming to replace you. Someone who doesn't live on Mount Olympus. Someone who lives in town. Man is going to replace you. And Zeus doesn't like that. Well, I'm going to see that your message never is received by them. So Zeus chains Prometheus to the top of Mount Elborez. Says, how do you like this? And Prometheus grits his teeth and he says, long blind ages may come and go, but eventually some human is going to come up that mountain and free me, and you're finished. I'm going to suffer for a very, very long time, but you're going to be finished permanently. What does Ricardo Montalban say in The Wrath of Khan? He says, revenge is a dish that must be served bitter cold. No. I will avenge you. It's a quality here in this education at this particular time We're looking at symbols because symbols are so all-powerful. They not only give form to the mind, but they recalibrate the entire integration cycle of nature. And so there's a quality of responsibility, but not from an authority mode, but responsibility from a reciprocal mode. We're responsible in the sense not because someone told us we have to be, but because we are, that whatever we do is going to elicit responses in their own turn. And the responsibility is keeping track of the reciprocal balances that a recalibration is going to engender. And the more that our frame of reference includes our self-consciousness, the more that the nature, which was from primordiality a given, no longer is a given. It becomes like a subconscious, becomes part of the frame of insight rather than the square of attention. And as we'll see next year, in April, when we shift from vision to art, when art comes into play, and art is an objective realm where the person is. There are no persons in nature at all. Persons are really supernatural. Persons are really secret forms. They're conscious forms. And quite different. But when the square of attention includes art, ritual slides into the frame of insight, leaves the square of attention. And the base of art, the base of that square of attention of art is myth. This is not to say in a simplistic way that all art is mythic, that all art has to have mythology in it. When this intelligence was really matured about the time of Schiller and Goethe, which was also the time of the great Romantic era, not only Schiller and Goethe in Germany, but you have people like Blake and Shelley, you have people like Napoleon, people like Jefferson. A whole age of revolution. Romantics and revolutionaries. They were the same thing together. The realization a couple hundred years ago, among men and women, the number one topic of consciousness was how art changes, recalibrates the way in which the mind really is, the way in which experience really happens, the way in which consciousness is able to style and transform itself, and how this process, by universal structure, can go either way, can go in a polarized fashion. You can have a Superman or a Frankenstein equally. It's not a throw of dice, but like a throw of a coin. Can go either way. And part of the intelligence of the last 100 years has been increasingly the realization that as ritual slides into the subconscious, that existence itself as an objectivity less and less participates in the square of attention of our reality. And if you took an overview of the history of the 19th century, it is a century where progressively physical reality dematerializes. One of our figures, which we're taking, Yeats, writes somewhere, I have the quotation somewhere, that around 1900 it was evident that physical materiality had dissolved and had left men and women suspended. Not high and dry, but high and who knows where. And it happened in the entire range of human experience. At the beginning of the 19th century, you look at portraits by David and you see physical people. And you look at the end of the century at a Cézanne portrait and all you see are facets of angles of possibility. The difference between a David and a Cézanne is an evolution during that century of dematerialization. At the beginning of the 19th century, you have a kind of a science that looks for physical elements, like Joseph Priestley discovering oxygen. Elements. At the end of the century, you have Maxwell's field equations about electromagnetism. The dissolving of existence, not out of reality, but out of the square of attention. And what rises, complementary in a reciprocality, is the increasing emphasis on the person. That the person counts. We're not satisfied to be just an ego. We're not satisfied to be a figure. We're not satisfied to fill roles. We're like a good actor who can fill roles, but many roles. Don't give me the same role. We can inhabit many different egos. We can have many lives within just one lifetime. And so the person becomes a multidimensional, scintillating prism that operates in a differential consciousness and loves to have variety. And one of the first harbingers of that kind of dimension of the person is Walt Whitman, one of the first people in the world to begin to speak in terms of differential conscious person. He writes a book in 1870 already called Democratic Vistas. And the very first paragraph he says, on looking at nature realistically, Mother Nature seems to prefer two qualities, freedom and variety. That's what she likes. She would like to have persons who are trying freedom and variety, and that's what she likes. And if you don't like that, it's too damn bad. Because she does. She has a taste for it. She likes adventurous kids. She likes her children to go as far out as they need to go, with the realization that if it's turning out in non-life way, change it. Because you can modify, you can transform, you can recalibrate everything in the natural cycle. Everything, including nature itself. Nature as a mystery is open, is amenable. She will cooperate. She will respond. And her response is on such a deep level that existence itself will change. So that transformation becomes key. And with symbols, transformation enters into the picture for the first time. While ritual comportment guarantees form, symbolic form guarantees transformation. And so you have this pair. You have existence and you have transformation. You have existence in the body, an extant body, but you have a transformational mind. And they're a pair. They go together. If they're not going together, they can just as easily go into opposition. The mind and the body can tough it out. And existence can say, I don't want to transform. That's exactly what I'm not going to do. And the mind says, you're going to transform, and now, and frequently. And so a war between the body and the mind is perfectly feasible. Why not? But the war, as a war, is an artifact of a polarity that doesn't have to run that way. By the slightest recalibration, it can run the other way. And the body can transform. And the transformation can have an embodiment. The possibilities of the body are unlimited when you add transformation to its dimensionality. The dimensionality of a transformational body is what it will be. The permutations have no limiting to it whatsoever. This quality comes to an nth degree in the person because as the symbolic body is able to transform indefinitely, the differentially conscious person is like light years beyond that. Their capabilities are infinite. There's no such thing as a limitation to the spiritual person, that it's some kind of form that then has to evolve into some new alien thing. It already has infinite possibilities. Much broader than imagined aliens. Imagined aliens are actually mythic function level, even below symbols. The imagination is protein, it's fantastic. But it's a mythic function. Whereas we'll find in January, in just a couple of weeks, that the functioning of consciousness in vision is not imagination, but memory. And memory is very powerful. Because memory can recalibrate. It can take an entire image base that seems endless and recalibrate the whole thing. It's like on a computer program. You suddenly click to a higher organizing order. You click to the font, and you come down and choose a different font. The typeface for the entire image base changes. So that an indexing capacity of differential conscious memory is powerful beyond belief. In fact, the ego cannot believe it. Because the ego is a form, a temporary form that engenders itself, wraps itself around with an image base. It wears images as clothing, and that's the only way that it is. If it took the images off, it would be invisible man time. And it's not that it's demure and doesn't want to be nude, but that it's scared and doesn't want to not be. So it needs that wardrobe and will do anything to keep it up to date. If you have its shoes and it needs its shoes, you better watch out. Those are my sneakers with 4-inch heels, and I'm going to get them. It's that kind of a weird, absurd, yet perilous quality that begins to suffuse. And where does it come in? It comes in as soon as the mind begins to get facility with symbols. The conscious qualities, the resonances, begin to come into play. And as those images of vision come into play, the ego finds a perfect rationalization to convince you not to become conscious. It shows you in its own beautiful, lawyer-like case-making. If you become conscious, nature's not going to be available to you. You're going to have to do all this stuff yourself. Nothing's going to be automatic. None of these functions are going to happen just automatically. You want to go over here? You want to take charge of everything? Okay, big yogi. Now you're going to have to control the breathing, the cardiovascular system, all this, and if you screw up, you're gone. You know, it's day in court is fabulous. The ego is, is fantastic. But what happens? What happens is an odd phenomenon. Some poet once said, Wallace Stevens, he said, why do men and women continue to transform in face of all of this peril? And in his poem he says, because they hear far off the sound of a beautiful bird whose song they seem to have heard before. They like it. And they don't care. So kill me, so scramble me, but I'm going. And that kind of courage the ego can do nothing about. It's totally helpless because ego is actually a coward. Will not go. In really tough crisis, you can form your body in tune to your spirit and just let your spirit rise, and your attention will rise right here to the Saharastra chakra. But the ego stops right here at the little hairs. It goes just to the tips of the little hairs and says, oh. Not quite that sophomoric. Usually it says, oh. But it cannot go. So the Egyptian symbol of eternity was Horus, the spiritual hawk flying just above the head. And later on in the old Hermetic things, you would see an infinity sign just above the head, like in the tarot cards. The magician at the table wears the tarot, or the infinity sign over the head. And if you look at the number 8 card, she has an infinity sign right over her head. Because they belong to that realm of transcendent differential consciousness. They know that nature has not disappeared. It's in a complementary frame of intuition. And when you use intuition, nature will be there. And because nature's intuitive quality is there in consciousness, it's like in mathematics and adding up numbers, and you get to 10, and you've got to carry the 1 over to a new column. Instead of nature disappearing, it carries over to a new column. There's a new column that opens up. And so the function, the intuitive function of the mystery of nature now operates in vision. So intuition is there in vision. It's like the Chinese who understood that Tao was 0 in the beginning, but when you get to the 5th phase, the 0 transposes and happens there. So where you counted 0, and then you counted 1, 2, 3, 4, by the time you get to 4, the 0 is transformed, and you count 1, 2, 3, 0. In Lao Tzu, who comes about 2,500 years after Fuxi, who saw the Tai Chi as an amulet holding the meaning of the trigrams, the 8 trigrams together, and how those trigrams come together, they integrate into hexagrams. And the hexagram matrix set is always the square of the base. So it's 8 times 8, 64. Out of 8 trigrams, you get 64 hexagrams. If you had supercomputer, Cray computer capacity, you could have 64 squared. You could have super kind of I Ching. 64 times 64, what would you call 12 lines? Not a hexagram, but a 12 line. Dodecagram. 21st century I Ching could have fabulous, be very unwieldy to consult unless you had your computer. But all you need is enough to set the universal structure into process. It's a principle called Occam's razor. The simplest level works. It's the principle of Bach flower remedies. You only just need enough of the cure to get the health process kicked into motion. And if you're sensitive enough, you don't need a pound of it. All you need is one molecule. And there are men and women alive today who, when they're little babies now, but when they mature, they'll be together enough that they won't have to take pills. Just trace molecules and they'll get the response. Because you can recalibrate the body to respond to any level of quantity whatsoever. You could get your flu shots in just a glint of light. It's very easy to do. It's just technically not feasible in 1996 because it hasn't been comprehended yet, because most consciousness is still bound up in its amulet phase. What is necessary is the facility to take an amulet, a symbolic sealing of indigo, and turn it inside out so it can be applied. In that case, the amulet becomes a talisman. And it's like Fuxi coming to the Tai Chi amulet 5,000 years ago, but in the hands of someone like a Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, he uses the Tai Chi as the beginning point, as a talisman, to develop a Tao expressively that influences the rest of Chinese history right up to the present day. It's the differential application of the Tai Chi that makes Chinese civilization that we've known it, that they've known it for the last 2,500 years. If you look at Chinese civilization before the talismanic application of the Tai Chi, they reached a certain level and that's about it. In fact, they got into a whole period where it was called the period of warring states because there was no growth possible. And as soon as you have Lao Tzu, you have a movement in Chinese civilization that within about 150 years, it takes that long for an idea to grow from the mind of one person until it is common knowledge on the street. It takes about 150 years for an idea to grow. There's such a thing as history of ideas now. There are doctors of civilization who could look at an idea and tell how long it's going to take to grow and get mature. And people like that are shepherds for the planet or the star system or whatever the unit happens to be that the species is using as home. And so a stellar shepherd looks at certain idea and realizes that the nutritive cycle is going to take such and so prepares so that this can happen with the best facility and the best application. And that's what's going on here. This little prescription for a really good future, really bright future. And by the middle of the 22nd century, our descendants are going to be champions. They're going to be really spectacular. But they're going to be most glad that we did what we can do if we do it. Because we will have got them where they are by getting us out of where we are. By us getting us out from where we are. We're in a dead-end junkyard. Nothing is ever going to work again. Here's how Yeats expressed it. Yeats, in realizing that some deep quality in him was surfacing, that he was like the inheritor of some magical tradition that had surfaced in him, and by the time he became mature, it took him a while to mature. He had such a precarious adolescence, and he had all these wild talent qualities. He was telepathic and clairvoyant and symbolic genius, and it took him a long time. But by the time that he was about in his mid-50s, Yeats had matured. And he wrote a poem called All Souls' Night, and here's how the first part of it runs. Midnight has come, and the great Christ Church bell and many a lesser bell sound through the room. And it is All Souls' Night, and 2 long glasses brimmed with muscatel bubble upon the table. A ghost may come, for it is a ghost's right. His element is so fine, being sharpened by his death, to drink from the wine breath, while our gross palates drink from the whole wine. I need some mind that, if cannons sound from every quarter of the world, can stay, wound in mind's pondering as mummies in a mummy cloth are wound, because I have a marvelous thing to say. A certain marvelous thing. None but the living mock, though not for sober ear. It may be that all that hear should laugh and weep upon the clock for an hour. And then he calls up the spirits of the dead to come and quaff the fragrance of the muscatel wine. And this entire poem, this All Souls' Night, which is the night after Halloween. Halloween is the penetration of the mythic horizon of the earth, going into the netherworld, going into the underworld. Going into the underworld, how? Vis-a-vis the earth's relationship to the sun. The sun's plane of ecliptic has been crossed, and the earth is now going underneath the plane of the sun. And the plane of the sun is actually from a very far distance away, say a distance of 1 light year. The plane of the sun is so thin that all the planets and all the moons and all the comets and everything are like a sheet of paper. Not much more than just a sheet of paper in space. But even in that minuscule third dimension, the movement of the earth under the sun's dead center plane, that plane of the ecliptic, the earth moving underneath it, has a different vibration. It's like if you go on this planet's surface from the northern hemisphere to the southern, water will drain the other way out of a drain. And if you get to dead center on the equator, it's very difficult, right exactly there, to get a swirl of water at all. Even the winds of the planets at dead center on the equator, they call them the doldrums. They don't blow very well. It's like reality is real all the way through. It's real when things are polarized, but it's also real when things are completely in equanimity. That equanimity also exists. And at the point of being sensitized to perfect equanimity, the slightest movement either way changes everything. And it's like in the mystery of nature, when the earth crosses that center hairline, solar plane, the planet enters into a different relationship vis-a-vis the star, vis-a-vis the sun. The point at which it enters is Halloween, and called Beltane in the ancient Celtic. And the first night after that is All Souls Night. All Hallows Night, because it's sacred. All Souls Night, because this is the reality entity that operates there. And Yeats was extremely alert to this kind of equality, because he was Irish, and he went not for the kind of astronomical point that one would have, which would be the autumnal equinox, which would be like September 21st. But he went for All Hallows Eve, for Beltane. So All Souls Night for Yeats was the first node of time where you have the repetition for the first time, the first night after Halloween, where one could summon underworld, netherworld spirits, the spirits of the dead. That in the summertime you can interview the living, but in the wintertime you can interview the dead. So that exactly at the winter solstice, what Paleolithic men and women would do was to make their peace with the underworld, with the netherworld. And the way that they made their peace is they made an appeal to the sun, because the sun was the center point of that whole plane and the only way in which one could come back. That if one did not make the conscious appeal at that time, you wouldn't come back. The earth would come back because it was a part of nature. The animals would come back because they're a part of nature. Less developed men and women would come back because they're still in the integral cycle. But someone who was conscious, who had entered into a supernatural dimension of themselves, they had to consciously come back and make those ceremonies. And so Yeats is making this poem because he's very conscious and he understands. What does he say later on? But names are nothing. What matter who it be, so that his elements have grown so fine, the fume of muscatel can give his sharpened palate ecstasy. No living man can drink from the whole wine. I have mummy truths to tell, whereat the living mock, though not for sober ear, for maybe all that hear should laugh and weep an hour upon the clock. Such thought, have I, that hold it tight, till meditation master all its parts. Nothing could stay my glance, until that glance run in the world's despite to where the damned had howled away their hearts, and where the blessed dance, such thought that in it bound I need no other thing, wound in minds wandering as mummies in a mummy cloth are wound. He's saying there's a point of total transformation, where if one has the transformation at the exact perfect center of equanimity, the transformation is irrevocably complete. That not only does this form transform to some other form, but everything it calibrates transforms along with it. When this Western idea hit Asia, it woke Asia up with a kind of romantic, revolutionary hallelujah. It happened about the end of the first century of the Common Era, first century AD. And the first Asian to get it was named Ashvaghosha, whose name in the Magadhi language of the time means the sound of a horse neighing, a horse that's feeling its oats. And Ashvaghosha, understanding an emissary from Alexandria for the first time, wrote the first book in Asian thought that had to do with the power of faith. In Sanskrit, it's called Shraddha, faith. And the book that Ashvaghosha wrote is called The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana. And out of that, Mahayana Buddhism was born. It was a completely Western transformation of Eastern thought. Eastern thought had always gone for moksha, for the bindu, for vanishing, for getting out of this world. And they were knocked out at the idea that not only could you completely get out of it, but that you would have the possibility, the choice, that if you wanted to come back into it. But only not coming back into it as some limited figure, but coming back into it with all the powers of differential infinity. Let's see what would happen. And what happens is one gets a multidimensional cosmos that has no bound. Later thought styled it as a jeweled matrix omniverse. More next week.